I retract my weed statement. Alcohol is a perfect example. We're all having drinks here, but if you become an alcoholic, a chronic alcoholic, it can ruin your life. Same thing as like, you name it, any given social problem, like a physical health problem, right? You can become so, diabetic that you start losing limbs and you can't work, and therefore you end up dependent and ultimately homeless once that wipes it out. So what I work on basically is kind of, I like to say sometimes, every single social problem, right? And how all of those interact in like really, complicated and interesting ways. So one of the things that, so for that reason, how do you deal with, conceptually, this is what I work on, is how do you deal with an ongoing social disaster, right? A social problem that is not understood as a disaster, because it's ever present, Ever since the 1980s, street homelessness, people living on the streets, sleeping in cars, sleeping like in alleyways or over storm drains, or steam grates, sorry, has been a permanent fixture on the landscape of every major urban environment, right? And so it's a perpetual disaster. And Mr. Smith, and I have, I'm sorry, I can't help it, spoon.
Spoon is good.
Was trying to kind of, one of the ideas that we began bouncing around was maybe we could consider homelessness to be a disaster, right? And therefore, what's the impact of that, right? Sure, it is a disaster, but because it's so taken for granted and mundane these days, because it's always happening, it's like an always problem, like we don't consider it a disaster. And should we? Can we? And like, what does that get us strategically? What does that enable us to do? Well, on the one hand, what's great about a government declaration of a disaster is that it means like all gloves are off, the money comes down from the ceiling, anything it takes to fix this thing. If there's a hurricane, we mobilize emergency resources. The school buses stop, taking kids to school, and they start taking people out of the flood zone. You know what I mean? The police stop, doing traffic stops, and they go down and control the disorder in the Superdome or something. Like everything changes when a disaster is declared, and budgetarily, it doesn't matter, right? Whatever it takes to get the situation under control in order to prevent social collapse, right? In order to prevent this disaster from becoming an apocalypse, So, what would it mean to declare an everyday social problem a disaster? Because from a humanitarian perspective, if you are on the ground, it's ridiculous, right? These people are, 10 times the rates of tuberculosis infection, 7 times the rates of HIV, 4 times the morbidity rate for homeless adults, right? 4 times the morbidity rate than the general population. Severe levels of mental. If you're homeless, you're experiencing exactly what a victim of Hurricane Katrina would experience on a daily level. So why can't we talk about it as a disaster? And what would it mean, like on the ground, to talk about it like that, or to implement it like that, to implement services to those folks as though it were a disaster? And for Flight One carriers, and this is, I guess, to start the conversation going, if we're appealing for funding, for example, or if not just Flight One carriers, but on the ground, as far as like bureaucracy, unfortunately, but also like conceptually, what would it mean to start trying to apply? And homelessness is a metaphor here. Take another AIDS, right? Hunger, domestic violence. Any advocate that's working in any of those spheres of social ills would say the same thing that I'm saying about homelessness. It's a disaster. You know what I mean? It's ridiculous in the military how many women are getting raped. It's ridiculous how much child abuse is going on. It's ridiculous, and so is that a disaster? Any given advocate in a given field would say, yeah, this is an ongoing social disaster, and we should be able to mobilize those resources in the same way that we do to Hurricane Katrina, right? Can we write grants that say that? Can we, on the ground, even if it wasn't a grant thing, if it was like a government, if the mayor said, let's treat it like that, right? What would that look like? And can that happen, right? So the title that I came up with when I was drunk was, for this kind of like talk is disaster preparedness, or socially impactful disaster preparedness, using homelessness in Baltimore City as an example, right? It's an example. There are many other social ills we could apply it to, right? Another really good example we'll be talking about is urban farming, right? The food desert effect that's citywide in Baltimore, but also in every urban center, really, is that there's not access to fresh vegetables. And so now you have in the community hypertension, diabetes, right? High cholesterol, just like all that stuff. So that's an ongoing health crisis. That's a public health crisis. That those that are, especially economically and also increasingly racially, disparately affected by this food desert thing. In poor black neighborhoods, there aren't as many grocery stores that have fresh vegetables. So it's a matter of fact, right? And that means that the health consequences of food deserts are felt in those communities uniquely, right? I'm talking about East and West Baltimore here, and also the Strip, the corridor from 20th or from North Avenue to 25th, right? These pockets of concentrated racialized poverty, right? So that's an ongoing crisis, right? So how can we? The question is, we're prepared. At what point can we decide that those are disasters? Right? Is that a disaster, and what are the implications of that? So, strategically, the benefit of calling those things disasters, right, is that we can mobilize a network of resources that were otherwise off limits, like emergency-style resources. The gloves are off as far as budgets are concerned, but also all the stuff that they've been stockpiling in case a disaster strikes. Perhaps we can use that immediately on the ground daily when it's not getting used. There's no hurricane right now, right? And so can we mobilize those resources to make an impact here? And I'm just talking abstractly here. I'm talking about water buffaloes, wheelbarrows. I'm talking about military ready-to-eat packets, right? I'm talking about wheelchairs, right? Generators, refrigeration units, mobile trucks that have refrigeration units. I'm talking trucks, right? Because the Office of Emergency Management in Baltimore City, as well as the Maryland Disaster Response Unit and FEMA, have all this stuff just sitting around, right? What we're talking about, the benefit of declaring it as like an ongoing social ill or disaster, is that we can start talking about getting all that shit, right, and using it every single day, because it's not getting used. It's sitting right over there, like 4 blocks from here in the warehouse, right? Why can't we use that every day? So that's the benefit of that, of calling something a social ill a disaster. We can get all that stuff together, and we can say that stuff in grants, right? We can say that stuff it's not just about money, but we can actually operationalize that, right? So